The morning of October 3, 1944. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. A Japanese soldier named Private Yasuo Yoshimura sits beneath a banyan tree, his body reduced to a skeletal frame of 78 pounds. In his hands, he holds a fistful of grass that he chews slowly, methodically, his jaw working with the deliberate effort of a man who understands this green paste might be the only thing keeping him alive another day. His uniform hangs from his shoulders like a funeral shroud. Around him, the jungle hums with the sound of insects and the occasional groan of dying men who, like him, wear the uniform of the Imperial Japanese Army but have not tasted rice in 4 months. 12 miles offshore, aboard the destroyer USS Nicholas, Seaman First Class Robert Hammond complains to his bunkmate about breakfast. The powdered eggs were cold again, the bacon was undercooked, and worst of all, criminally, unforgivably, the ship's ice cream machine has been broken for 3 days running. There has been no dessert. Morale, according to the ship's log, is reported as unsatisfactory. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is not fiction. This is not an exaggeration. This is the documented reality of the Pacific War in World War II, a conflict that revealed not just which side had braver soldiers or better generals, but which nation possessed the industrial capacity to feed, supply, and sustain its fighting men across 6,000 miles of ocean. This is the story of how starvation killed more Japanese soldiers than American bullets ever did. And how, in one of history's cruelest ironies, the American military spent $1 million, 17 million in today's currency, building a floating ice cream factory while enemy troops 3 miles away were eating the bark off trees. This is the story of logistics as destiny, industrial might as the ultimate weapon, of 2 nations locked in total war, where one side could afford to care about its soldiers' happiness while simultaneously building the most powerful military machine in human history, and the other could not even deliver rice. The gap between these 2 realities, between grass and ice cream, between starvation and surplus, was not just about food. It was about everything that separated 19th century military thinking from 20th century industrial warfare, and that gap would determine who lived, who died, and who won the Pacific War. By the autumn of 1944, the Japanese Empire was losing the war, though most soldiers on isolated Pacific islands did not yet know it. They had been told, again and again through official communiques and officers' speeches, that reinforcements were coming, that supply ships were en route, that the emperor himself was watching their sacrifice with pride, that every grain of rice they saved, every bullet they conserved, every day they held their positions, brought the empire closer to final victory. None of it was true. The reality, visible from the corridors of power in Tokyo but invisible to the starving men on Guadalcanal, Rabaul, New Guinea, and dozens of other bypassed islands, was that Japan's merchant fleet was dying. American submarines, operating with devastating efficiency since mid-1942, were sinking Japanese cargo vessels faster than shipyards could replace them. By 1943, Japan had lost over 1,000 merchant ships. By 1944, that number exceeded 2,000. Each sunken vessel represented not just tons of steel settling to the ocean floor, but food that would never reach hungry soldiers, medicine that would never treat dying men, ammunition that would never fire. The Americans had adopted a strategy called island hopping, a term that sounds almost casual, almost recreational, as if troops were skipping stones across a pond. But for the Japanese garrisons left behind on the hopped islands, the strategy was nothing less than a death sentence carried out in slow motion. Instead of assaulting every Japanese-held island, American forces simply bypassed the most heavily fortified positions, cutting off their supply lines and leaving tens of thousands of soldiers to wither in place. The rising sun still flew over their bunkers, officers still gave orders, soldiers still stood watch, but no ships arrived, no planes dropped supplies, the war moved on without them, and they starved. On Guadalcanal alone, 15,000 Japanese soldiers died, but only 5,000 fell in combat. The remaining 10,000 died of starvation and disease. At Rabaul in New Britain, 69,000 Japanese troops were trapped from late 1943 until war's end. In the Philippines, of 498,000 Japanese deaths, 400,000 were from hunger and related causes. In New Guinea, General Hatatsu Adachi's 18th Army of perhaps 100,000 men was cut off and left to starve. Most perished not from Australian or American fire, but from the simple, grinding, degrading process of their own bodies consuming themselves. This was not an accident of war. This was not bad luck or unfortunate circumstances. This was the predictable, inevitable result of a military philosophy that had neglected logistics for nearly half a century. The Japanese General Staff, since the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, had treated logistics as somehow beneath the dignity of real warriors. Transport officers were ineligible for admission to the War College. At the time of the Russo-Japanese War, only 4% of military academy graduates chose to enter the logistics corps. The attitude pervaded the entire command structure. Real soldiers fought. Real officers led charges. Real battles were won by spirit, by Bushido, by the willingness to die for the emperor. Food, fuel, ammunition, these were details for lesser men to worry about. Major Iwagoe, in a document produced by the General Staff Headquarters during the war, warned against assuming that things can be worked out on the battlefield, without any thought given to supplying the units from the rear. He wrote that securing a communication and supply line at sea is vital to island operations, and that marine logistics depend upon command of the air. His warnings went unheeded, or rather, they were heard, acknowledged, and then systematically ignored by a command structure that had spent decades teaching its officers that willpower could overcome material disadvantage. The result was an army trained to live off the land, as it advanced a doctrine that might have worked in China, where villages could be plundered and farmers coerced into providing food, but which proved catastrophic on small Pacific islands that could barely sustain their native populations, let alone 10 or 20,000 additional soldiers. Palm trees do not grow rice, coral atolls do not produce vegetables, and jungle vegetation, while abundant, is largely inedible to humans without extensive preparation and knowledge that most Japanese soldiers did not possess. So they ate what they could find: coconuts, stripped from every tree within marching distance, roots, dug from the earth and boiled into tasteless mush, snails and insects, collected with desperate efficiency, snakes when they could catch them. Rats became delicacies. One soldier's diary from New Guinea records his joy at successfully trapping a small lizard, which he shared with 3 other men, each receiving a portion no larger than a thumbnail. As the weeks turned into months, as the supply situation worsened from merely bad to catastrophic, as men began to die, not occasionally, but daily, the soldiers' diaries and letters, those that survived the war, reveal a descent into a nightmare that the human mind struggles to comprehend. A Japanese non-commissioned officer on Guadalcanal recorded what he called the mathematics of death by starvation. His notes, recovered after the Japanese evacuation in February 1943, read, "Those who can stand 30 days, those who can sit up 3 weeks, those who cannot sit 1 week, those who urinate lying down 3 days, those who have stopped speaking 2 days, those who have stopped blinking tomorrow." This was not poetry. This was practical triage. This was how a soldier determined which of his comrades might still be saved and which were already corpses who simply hadn't finished dying yet. Private Yasuo Itabashi, describing his forced landing on the island of Biak off the northeast coast of New Guinea, wrote of how food took on a new meaning when it became scarce. Soldiers who had once eaten meals without thought now treated every grain of rice, every scrap of dried fish, as precious beyond measure. Men would save portions of their rations not to eat but simply to hold, to look at, to remind themselves that food still existed in the world. Sergeant Shoji Takezawa, stationed in the South Pacific, wrote in his memoir about hearing the emperor's surrender broadcast on August 15, 1945. Perhaps because I started listening partway through, it was hard for me to hear his voice. To be truthful, his voice sounded as weak as I felt. I wondered if the emperor, like us, hadn't eaten. The irony, though, Takezawa could not have known it was that the emperor was fine. The emperor ate well. It was only his soldiers, his supposedly sacred warriors, his instruments of divine will, who were starving to death on forgotten islands while the world moved on. But the problem extended beyond just food. The collapse of Japanese logistics meant that soldiers lacked everything needed to fight effectively or even survive. Medicine became impossible to obtain. Malaria, which could be treated with quinine, instead ravaged entire units because the quinine never arrived. Dengue fever, scrub typhus, and a dozen other tropical diseases turned encampments into open-air hospitals where the sick cared for the dying and where both groups slowly joined the dead. Ammunition grew scarce. Rifles, rendered useless without bullets, became clubs. Artillery pieces sat silent, their ammunition exhausted months earlier. Some Japanese positions were defended by soldiers armed only with bamboo spears, not out of fanatical devotion to Bushido, but because they literally had nothing else. Uniforms rotted in the tropical humidity. Boots disintegrated. Soldiers went barefoot through jungle terrain that shredded their feet, leading to infections that in turn led to amputations or death. The simple lack of boots killed men. One Japanese army report, circulated internally in 1944 but never shared with the public, admitted that the average soldier in the South Pacific is no longer combat capable. Not because he lacks courage, not because he fears death, but because he weighs approximately 85 pounds, cannot march more than 1 kilometer without rest, and lacks the physical strength to aim and fire his weapon accurately. This was the reality facing Private Yoshimura and thousands like him. Not a quick death in glorious combat, but a slow, humiliating dissolution. A death that stripped away everything that made him a soldier, then everything that made him a man, until what remained was simply a biological organism in its final stages of systemic failure. And 12 miles offshore, American sailors complained about cold eggs. But before we condemn those sailors for their complaints, before we dismiss their concerns as trivial or spoiled, we must understand the context that made such complaints possible. We must understand the machine that was the American industry in World War II, and why ice cream was not an indulgence but a weapon. The United States had entered World War II with an economy still recovering from the Great Depression. Unemployment in 1941 hovered near 15%. Factories stood idle or operated at partial capacity. The automobile industry, one of America's proudest achievements, sold an average of 3.3 million cars per year during the late 1930s, respectable numbers, but far below potential. Then came Pearl Harbor, then came total war, and then came the most astonishing industrial transformation in human history. In 1941, the United States produced 3,000 aircraft for military use. By 1944, at the peak of wartime production, that number exceeded 96,000 per year. Tank production went from 331 units in 1940 to 29,497 in 1943. Shipyards, which had launched modest numbers of vessels in peacetime, now produced tonnage so fast that by the autumn of 1943, all Allied shipping sunk since 1939 had been replaced. In 1944 alone, the United States built more planes than Japan did from 1939 to 1945 combined. The gross national product of the United States grew by 52% between 1939 and 1944. Industrial output tripled. Unemployment fell to 1.2% in 1944, the lowest in American economic history, as near to full employment as any economy has ever achieved. War-related production skyrocketed from just 2% of GNP in 1939 to 40% in 1943. These numbers are so large they become almost meaningless. Let me make them concrete. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan, built B-24 Liberator bombers. Each bomber contained 1,550,000 parts, 100 times more components than the average. Ford automobile. The assembly line, once it reached full efficiency, produced one complete bomber every 63 minutes. One bomber every hour, around the clock. Mobile, Alabama, a modest southern city, became one of the busiest shipbuilding ports in the nation. Gulf Shipbuilding employed 240 workers in 1940. By 1943, that number reached 11,600. Alabama Dry Dock went from 1,000 workers to nearly 30,000. These were not skilled craftsmen trained over years. These were farmers, store clerks, housewives, and teenagers, pulled into factories and taught to weld, rivet, and assemble in a matter of weeks. William Knudsen, the automotive industry executive who became chairman of the Office of Production Management, later explained American victory simply. "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the likes of which he had never seen, nor dreamed possible." But the scale of production was only half the story. The other half was distribution, the mind-boggling challenge of moving all those tanks, planes, ships, bullets, bombs, and yes, food, across thousands of miles of ocean to where they were needed. This was the true American miracle of World War II, not just making things, but delivering them. Not just building a bomber in Michigan, but getting that bomber to an airstrip in New Guinea with fuel in its tanks, bombs in its belly, and a crew that had eaten breakfast. Not just manufacturing ammunition in Pennsylvania, but ensuring that ammunition reached a Marine on Guadalcanal exactly when he needed it. The logistics involved were staggering. A single American Army division in the Pacific required 400,000 mechanical horsepower to keep it moving 10 times what was needed for a division in World War I. That division needed food, water, fuel, ammunition, medicine, spare parts, mail from home, and yes, ice cream. By 1944, through Knudsen's expansion of government contracts and the ruthless efficiency of American manufacturing, the United States was producing 2/3 of all Allied military equipment used in the war. American factories were arming not just American soldiers, but British troops, Soviet forces, Chinese armies, Free French units, and resistance fighters across occupied Europe. In 1943, more than 15% of American aircraft production, 15,000 planes, went to Allied nations through Lend-Lease. In 1944, that figure exceeded 16% of a production run that topped 96,000 aircraft. The United States launched more vessels in 1941 than Japan did in the entire war. American production of vehicles totaled 3 million in 1941 alone, and that was before the automobile industry had fully converted to military production. In 1941, more than 3 million civilian cars rolled off American assembly lines. During the next 4 years of war, only 139 more civilian automobiles were manufactured. Instead, Chrysler made fuselages. General Motors made airplane engines, guns, trucks, and tanks. Packard made Rolls-Royce engines for the British Air Force. And this industrial tsunami, this avalanche of steel, aluminum, rubber, and explosive, was managed, coordinated, and delivered by the most sophisticated logistics system ever created. The United States didn't just outproduce Japan. It outthought Japan. It outorganized Japan. It outsupplied Japan by such a margin that the war became less a test of military valor and more an exercise in mathematics, where the side with more ships, more planes, more fuel, and more food could literally afford to trade losses until the other side simply ceased to exist. But we're talking about ice cream. Let's talk about ice cream. On July 1st, 1914, the United States Navy banned alcohol aboard all naval vessels. This happened years before prohibition made liquor illegal across the entire country, and it was driven by Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, a devoted supporter of the temperance movement. Sailors were not pleased. The tradition of the rum ration, dating back centuries in naval culture, ended with a stroke of Daniel's pen. General Order 99, as it was called, removed even the serving of alcohol in the wardroom and captain's cabin. 6 years later, in 1920, prohibition came to all of America. Breweries shut down or converted to making soda and near beer. Speakeasies proliferated, and, curiously, ice cream consumption exploded. Between 1916 and 1925, ice cream consumption in the United States skyrocketed by 55%. By the end of the decade, Americans were consuming nearly 1 million gallons every single day. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, did not slow this trend. If anything, it accelerated. Ice cream was one of the few comforting luxuries almost anyone could afford. The popular flavor Rocky Road chocolate, mixed with nuts and chunks of marshmallow, was introduced by ice cream manufacturer William Dreyer in 1929, specifically as a metaphor for the hard times Americans were experiencing. The name caught on, the flavor caught on. Ice cream became embedded in American culture as comfort food, as affordable pleasure, as a small taste of happiness in difficult times. Then came World War II, and ice cream transitioned from comfort food to military necessity. When the United States joined the war in December 1941, the government initially declared ice cream a non-essential food, subject to rationing like sugar, butter, and meat. The International Association of Ice Cream Manufacturers and the National Dairy Council lobbied vigorously against this classification. Their argument was not sentimental, it was practical. American fighting men, they argued, were being asked to endure conditions of unimaginable hardship. They were being shipped to tropical hellholes, frozen tundras, and disease-ridden jungles. They were being separated from families, from homes, from everything familiar. Many would never return. The least the nation could do, the absolute minimum gesture of appreciation, was to give them ice cream. The government reversed its decision. Ice cream was not only removed from rationing restrictions, but was actually placed on the official chart of 7 basic foods, the precursor to the modern food pyramid. Ice cream, by government decree, became essential nutrition. The military, particularly the Navy, embraced this policy with enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, assigned ice cream top priority after one of his assistants reported that ice cream, in my opinion, has been the most neglected of all the important morale factors. Ships large enough to house them were fitted with ice cream bars. Carriers installed ice cream parlors. Submarines, despite their cramped quarters, carried ice cream makers. The stories that emerged from this policy verged on the absurd, or would have, if they weren't so thoroughly documented. On May 8, 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, the aircraft carrier USS Lexington was hit by multiple Japanese bombs and torpedoes. Fires raged through the ship. Explosions tore apart compartments. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Captain Frederick Sherman gave the order to abandon ship. The crew obeyed, but not before breaking into the ship's ice cream storage and consuming every last scoop. Survivors later described filling their helmets with ice cream and licking them clean before lowering themselves into the Pacific Ocean. Some sailors were late reaching the lifeboats because they refused to leave until the ice cream was gone. Not the ammunition, not the classified documents, the ice cream. This was not isolated behavior. This was institutional culture. If a destroyer or submarine rescued a downed pilot from an aircraft carrier, the pilot's home ship would pay a ransom of 5 gallons of ice cream for his return. This was standard practice. This was how the United States Navy conducted business in the middle of a war that would kill 400,000 Americans. And then came the ice cream barge. By 1945, demand for ice cream had reached such proportions that the Navy spent $1 million, $17 million in today's currency, converting a concrete barge into a floating ice cream factory. The barge, officially designated BRL for barge, refrigerated, large, was acquired from the Army and retrofitted at enormous expense. The conversion included industrial ice cream making equipment capable of producing 10 gallons every 7 minutes. That's 500 gallons per shift. That's 5 tons of ice cream per day. The barge could store an additional 2,000 gallons in refrigerated compartments. Why concrete? Because of metal shortages. Early in the war, the Navy had contracted Pennsylvania-based firm McCloskey and Company to build 24 6,000-ton concrete barges to transport supplies. These barges were unpopular with Navy crews. They had no engines and had to be towed by tugboats. They were slow, unwieldy, and generally despised. Most were offloaded to the Army's Transportation Corps as soon as possible. But the ice cream barge became one of the most popular vessels in the fleet. Sailors stationed at Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands, a forward base in the Western Pacific, would line up for hours in tropical heat for a scoop of chocolate or vanilla. Ships that came within range would send boats to collect their allocation. The barge became legendary. Sailors wrote home about it. Officers mentioned it in reports. It appeared in official Navy histories, not as a footnote or curiosity, but as a significant morale factor in the Pacific campaign. But the Navy's ice cream obsession went further, much further. Bomber crews stationed on islands without refrigeration facilities discovered they could make ice cream at altitude. They would mix cream, sugar, and flavorings in containers, then fly to 20,000 feet where the outside temperature was well below freezing. The cold air at altitude would freeze the mixture during the flight. Crews would return to base with homemade ice cream. This was not a rare occurrence. This was common enough that it appeared in training manuals and squadron newsletters. The Army's Quartermaster Corps, not to be outdone by the Navy, provided American troops with the machinery and ingredients to manufacture approximately 80 million gallons of ice cream every year during the war. In 1943 alone, it shipped out 135 million pounds of dehydrated ice cream mix to the front lines. Any soldier with access to refrigeration, water, powdered milk could whip up ice cream right at the firing line. And they did, regularly. By late 1944, American forces in the Pacific had access to ice cream in quantities that would have been considered excessive in peacetime. Forward bases had ice cream parlors. Hospital ships served ice cream to wounded men. Newly constructed airfields would have ice cream facilities operational before the control tower was complete. It was everywhere. It was abundant. It was, by any rational measure, completely insane. Unless you understood what it represented. Ice cream was not about ice cream. Ice cream was about capacity. It was about the ability to manufacture and transport a frozen dessert across 6,000 miles of ocean, while simultaneously building the most powerful military in human history. It was about having so much industrial surplus that you could afford to dedicate ships, fuel, manpower, and resources to something as frivolous as dessert. It was about sending a message not deliberately, not as propaganda, but simply through the casual exercise of overwhelming material superiority. And the Japanese knew it. They knew it. And it destroyed their morale more effectively than any bombing raid. Captured Japanese officers, when interrogated after the war, repeatedly cited American logistics as the most demoralizing aspect of the fighting. Not American courage, not American marksmanship, not American tactics, logistics. The simple, grinding, undeniable reality that American soldiers had everything they needed and Japanese soldiers had nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a Japanese army officer who survived the war, wrote in his memoir, "We fought soldiers who had chocolate, cigarettes, and coffee delivered to the front lines. We could not comprehend it. How do you fight an enemy who treats war like a picnic?" Another captured officer, whose name was not recorded in the interrogation transcript, stated, "We knew we could not win when we saw that American soldiers would discard rations if they did not like the taste. We were eating grass. They were choosing between beef and chicken." A Japanese naval officer stationed at Rabaul described watching through binoculars as American ships unloaded supplies on a nearby island. They stacked crates on the beach like children's blocks. Hundreds of crates. Thousands. When they ran out of room on the beach, they built warehouses. When they ran out of room in the warehouses, they built more warehouses. They had so much that they treated supplies carelessly, like they were infinite. Meanwhile, we were rationing bullets. This psychological impact cannot be overstated. The Japanese military philosophy emphasized spirit over material, willpower over firepower, sacrifice over survival. Soldiers were trained to believe that determination could overcome any disadvantage. That Bushido, the way of the warrior, made them superior to soft, materialistic Americans who valued comfort over honor. And then those soldiers encountered the reality of the Pacific War, where American troops were not soft but superbly equipped, where Americans did not lack spirit but also had unlimited ammunition, where the choice was never spirit versus material, but rather spirit with material versus spirit without material. And in that contest, there was no contest. Japanese soldiers watching American supply operations saw their entire worldview collapse. They had been told that sacrifice was strength, that hardship built character, that suffering proved devotion. But suffering, they discovered, did not win battles. Suffering just made you weak and hungry and dead. Vice Admiral Raizo Tanaka, commander of Japanese naval forces in the Solomons, wrote after the war, "There is no question that Japan's doom was sealed with the closing of the struggle for Guadalcanal." But he did not attribute this to American military superiority in a traditional sense. He attributed it to logistics. We could not supply our forces. The Americans could. Everything else followed from that single fact. Everything else followed from that single fact. Let that sink in. A Japanese admiral, reflecting on the defeat of his nation, did not blame inferior weapons, or cowardly soldiers, or poor strategy. He blamed logistics. He blamed the fact that Japan could not deliver rice while America could deliver ice cream. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The contrast between Japanese starvation and American abundance was not just philosophical or psychological. It was visceral, immediate, and literally visible across battle lines. On Guadalcanal, in December 1942, an American Liberty ship offloaded 30,000 cases of beer at the beachhead. 30,000 cases. For the Marines who had been fighting since August, it was a moment of relief and celebration. The beer was warm, the cans were dented, and nobody cared. It was beer. It was from home. It was evidence that the supply line worked. That same week, on the other side of the island, a Japanese soldier recorded the mathematics of death by starvation that we mentioned earlier. Those who can stand 30 days, those who can sit up 3 weeks. His unit had not received supplies in over a month. Men were dying at a rate of 12 per day, their bodies piling up faster than the survivors had strength to bury them. The Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal in February 1943, Operation K, was considered a tactical success by Japanese command. They extracted approximately 10,652 soldiers from the island under the cover of darkness, using destroyers and fast transports. American forces did not realize an evacuation was underway until it was nearly complete. In this sense, the operation succeeded brilliantly. But of the 36,000 Japanese troops originally sent to Guadalcanal, more than 25,000 were dead. And of those extracted, 600 died of injuries or illnesses before they could receive medical care. Another 3,000 required lengthy hospitalization or recuperation. These were not fighting men, these were walking corpses, their bodies so ravaged by starvation that survival itself was uncertain. Many weighed less than 85 pounds. Most could not walk without assistance. A significant number were blind from vitamin deficiency. They had beriberi, malaria, dengue fever, and a dozen other diseases that flourished in malnourished bodies. Japanese military doctors examining the evacuees were horrified. One doctor's report, filed with the 18th Army Medical Corps, stated, "These men have been reduced to a condition I have only seen in photographs of European concentration camps. Their internal organs are failing. Their immune systems are non-existent. Many will not survive, and those who do survive will never be combat-capable again." The 2nd Division and 38th Division, the main units evacuated from Guadalcanal, were shipped to Rabaul for rest and reconstitution. The 2nd Division was later relocated to the Philippines in March 1943, but these divisions were never the same. They had been broken not by American firepower but by starvation. The men who survived carried psychological scars that no amount of training or indoctrination could overcome. They had learned, at a cellular level, that their nation could not protect them, could not feed them, could not even deliver rice. Meanwhile, the American forces on Guadalcanal, the 1st Marine Division that had borne the brunt of the fighting from August to December 1942, were relieved by Army units and shipped to Australia for rest. These Marines had also suffered. The average Marine in the 1st Division lost 30 pounds during 4 months on Guadalcanal. Many had malaria. Many had combat fatigue. But they had eaten. They had received medical care. They had, occasionally, even had ice cream. And after 8 months of rest, recuperation, and training, the 1st Marine Division was reconstituted as a combat-effective unit and sent back into action. The Japanese divisions evacuated from Guadalcanal never fully recovered. This pattern repeated across the Pacific. At Rabaul in New Britain, 69,000 Japanese soldiers and 20,000 civilian workers were trapped from late 1943 until the end of the war. They were not attacked. They were not invaded. They were simply bypassed, left to sit on their heavily fortified island while the war moved on. The Japanese garrison at Rabaul had enough ammunition to fight for years. They had artillery, bunkers, tunnels, and defensive positions that would have cost thousands of American lives to assault. But they didn't have food. The island could not support 90,000 people. Within 6 months, starvation set in. Within a year, disease was epidemic. By war's end, tens of thousands had died without ever engaging American forces. When Australian troops occupied Rabaul after the Japanese surrender in September 1945, they found a functioning military base manned by skeletons. The artillery still worked, the bunkers were intact, but the soldiers were too weak to fight. The same story played out on Truk, on Bougainville, on New Ireland, on dozens of islands across the Pacific. Japanese garrisons were cut off and left to wither. No supply ships, no relief convoys, no food drops, just silence and starvation. American forces, by contrast, ate well, not just adequately. Well, a typical American soldier in the Pacific received approximately 4,000 calories per day, far more than needed for health, but considered necessary given the physical demands of combat and tropical conditions. Rations included canned meats, fruits, vegetables, crackers, chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, and yes, when available, ice cream. The quality varied. Nobody would claim that military rations were delicious, but they were abundant, calorie-dense, and delivered with remarkable regularity even to the most remote outposts. The logistical achievement required to make this happen cannot be overstated. Every can of beef, every chocolate bar, every cigarette had to be manufactured in the United States, loaded onto ships, transported across thousands of miles of ocean, unloaded at forward bases, stored in tropical conditions without spoiling, and finally distributed to individual soldiers often fighting in jungles with no roads and limited infrastructure. The fact that this system worked not perfectly, but well enough was itself a kind of miracle. And it worked because America treated logistics as warfare, because American military planners understood that soldiers who eat fight better than soldiers who starve. That seems obvious to us now. It was not obvious to the Japanese command, which continued to emphasize spirit over supply until the bitter end. The industrial statistics tell the story in stark terms. In 1944, the United States produced 96,318 aircraft, 2,654 naval vessels, 17,328 tanks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Japan, that same year, produced 28,180 aircraft, 248 naval vessels, 353 tanks, and a fraction of the ammunition. Its soldiers were starving. The disparity was so enormous that it strains belief. American industrial output was roughly 10 times Japanese output across most categories. In some categories, like shipbuilding and tank production, the gap was even wider. The United States had twice the productive output per person compared to Germany, and 5 times that of Japan. But raw production numbers, while impressive, don't fully capture the picture. America also had to supply its allies. Britain, fighting in Europe and North Africa, received vast quantities of American equipment. The Soviet Union, bearing the brunt of the German onslaught on the Eastern Front, received American trucks, tanks, aircraft, food, and raw materials through the Lend-Lease program. China, struggling against Japanese invasion, received American aid. Free French forces, Polish units, resistance fighters across occupied Europe, all were armed and supplied in part by American production. In essence, America was not just equipping its own military, it was equipping half the world's militaries. And it was doing so while also improving living standards for civilians at home. Despite rationing, despite shortages of particular items like rubber and nylon, American civilians during World War II actually increased their consumption of goods and services. This was unique among all combatant nations. Britain was on strict rationing. Germany was on strict rationing. The Soviet Union experienced mass civilian starvation. Japan experienced severe shortages and declining nutrition, even in the home islands. Only America got richer during the war. Only America produced so much that both soldiers and civilians had more at the end than at the beginning. This was the true power that defeated Japan. Not courage, not better tactics, not superior soldiers. Power. Raw, industrial, logistical power, deployed with ruthless efficiency across a theatre of war that stretched from Alaska to Australia, from California to China. And nowhere was this power more visible than in the supply chains that kept American forces fed, equipped, and fighting while Japanese forces starved within sight of American positions. By late 1944, the pattern was well established. American forces would land on an island, establish a beachhead, and within days, sometimes within hours, supply operations would begin. Trucks would roll off, landing craft. Bulldozers would clear roads, engineers would build warehouses, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and field hospitals. Within a week, the island would have reliable supply lines. Within a month, it would have ice cream. Japanese forces, watching from their positions, could see the supply ships arriving, could see the endless crates being unloaded, could smell the food cooking, and they could do nothing. Their orders were to hold their positions, to wait for reinforcements that would never come, to preserve their strength for a final battle that would never happen. So they held on, and they waited, and they starved. There's a particular cruelty to dying of starvation in sight of abundance. To know that food exists, that it's being consumed by men just like you, but that you cannot have any, that your own supply lines have failed, that your own nation has abandoned you, that you are expendable in ways the enemy's soldiers are not. This psychological torture, and that's what it was, even if unintentional, broke Japanese morale more effectively than any bombing campaign. Soldiers began to question orders. Officers lost authority. Discipline, the foundation of military effectiveness, began to erode. Some units maintained cohesion until the end, others descended into chaos. There are documented cases of Japanese soldiers deserting their units, not to surrender to Americans that remained unthinkable for most, but simply to search for food on their own. Some turned to eating the dead. Cannibalism, while rare, was not unknown. It was reported on New Guinea, on several islands in the Philippines, and in isolated garrisons throughout the Pacific. Most accounts involve Japanese soldiers consuming the bodies of dead American pilots or sailors washed ashore, not their own comrades. But even this distinction began to blur as starvation worsened. Japanese military police reports from 1944 and 1945 mention cases of soldiers being caught attempting to kill and consume other soldiers. These reports were classified and not made public until decades after the war, but they paint a picture of an army in terminal collapse, and through it all, American supply lines continued to function. The ice cream kept flowing. There's a specific incident that captures the absurdity of the contrast. In early 1945, an American supply convoy was offloading cargo at a forward base in the Philippines. The convoy included ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, food, and, yes, ice cream. A Japanese unit, starving and desperate, attempted a nighttime raid on the supply dump. They were not trying to destroy it, they were trying to steal food. American sentries detected the approach and called for support. In the firefight that followed, 17 Japanese soldiers were killed. When American forces examined the bodies the next morning, they found that most of the dead had been too weak to run. Several had literally died trying to crawl toward crates of supplies. One soldier, found dead just 15 feet from a pallet of canned goods, weighed 69 pounds. The American officer who wrote the after-action report noted, almost as an aside, enemy combatants appeared motivated by hunger rather than tactical objectives. Recommend increased security during supply operations, as starving enemy forces are likely to attempt similar raids. Increased security. That was the response. Not horror, not pity. Just practical adjustment to the fact that enemy soldiers were now so desperate for food they would attack supply dumps in suicidal raids just for the chance to eat. This was total war. This was what it looked like when one side had everything and the other side had nothing. The numbers are clear, but numbers alone cannot convey the human reality. So let me tell you about a man named Private First Class Kiyoshi Kamiko, whose diary was recovered after the war and translated by Allied occupation authorities in 1946. Kamiko was 22 years old when he was deployed to New Guinea in March 1943. He was from a farming family in Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan. He had 3 years of middle school education, which made him more literate than most soldiers in his unit. His diary entries, written in pencil on whatever scraps of paper he could find, provide a window into the daily degradation of starvation. March 23, 1943. We have arrived at our position. The jungle is thick and full of insects, but our spirit is strong. We will defend this place with our lives. The Emperor is watching. April 2nd, 1943. Rice rations reduced to 2/3. Officers say supplies are delayed but will arrive soon. We found some fruit in the jungle. It tasted strange but filled our bellies. May 10th, 1943. Still no supply ship. Rice rations reduced again. Each man receives 1 small bowl per day. The jungle. Fruit makes many men sick with diarrhea. Corporal Ito died yesterday. The medic says it was dysentery. We buried him near the supply tent. June 4th, 1943. 30 days since we received supplies. The rice is gone. We are eating whatever we can find. I caught a snake today and shared it with 5 others. It barely filled a tooth. My stomach hurts constantly. Time has no meaning when every day is the same hunger. Yamada fell down during morning assembly and could not stand. Lieutenant Sato beat him for showing weakness, but Yamada still could not stand. Later we learned Yamada had died. We are too weak to dig proper graves anymore. We cover the bodies with leaves and stones. August 1st, 1943. I can see my ribs. My uniform hangs on me like a tent. When I urinate, it is dark orange and smells terrible. The medic says this is a sign of organ failure, but there is no medicine. Anyway, so what does it matter? I think about food constantly. I dream of my mother's cooking. I wake up thinking the dream was real, and then I remember where I am, and the hunger is worse than before. September 17th, 1943. Watched American planes fly overhead today. They dropped bombs on the airfield 3 kilometers away, but none landed near us. I almost wished they had. At least that would be quick. This is not a soldier's death. This is dying like a dog in a ditch. October 3rd, 1943. My teeth are loose. My gums bleed when I touch them. The medic says this is scurvy. He says we need vegetables and fruit, but we have eaten everything in the jungle that looked remotely edible. Some men have started eating grass and leaves that even animals won't touch. This makes them vomit, which makes them weaker, which makes them more desperate, which makes them eat more grass. It is a circle of death. November 28th, 1943. I can no longer write every day because I am too weak. My hands shake. My vision is blurry. I write this entry sitting down because I cannot stand for more than a few minutes. Half the men in my platoon are dead. The other half wish they were. Lieutenant Sato still gives orders, but nobody has the strength to follow them. He talks about honor and duty and the emperor, but his words sound hollow. What honor is there in starving to death? January 7th, 1944. I am 23 years old today. Nobody remembered because nobody cares. I don't know what I weigh. We have no scale, but I can wrap my hand around my thigh and my fingers touch easily. I look like a skeleton with skin stretched over it. We all do. When we look at each other, we see corpses that haven't finished dying yet. February 14th, 1944. Heard artillery in the distance today. American or Australian forces moving closer. Part of me hopes they come. Part of me hopes I die before they arrive. I am too weak to fight. I am too weak to surrender with dignity. I am just weak. March 1st, 1944. Corporal Nakamura died last night. He was talking to me about his wife, showing me her photograph, and then he stopped talking mid-sentence. Just stopped. His eyes were open, but he was dead. We left his body where it fell. Nobody has the strength to move corpses anymore. The camp is full of bodies. Some have been dead for weeks. The smell is terrible, but you get used to it. April 9th, 1944. I saw an American observation plane fly low over our position today, low enough that I could see the pilot. He looked well-fed, healthy. His plane was clean and new. I realized at that moment that we have already lost this war. Not because they have better planes or more soldiers, but because they are alive and we are dead. We just haven't fallen over yet. May 3rd, 1944, my last entry. I can barely hold the pencil. My hands shake too much. I want to write something meaningful, something that would make my family proud. But all I can think about is food, rice, fish, vegetables, anything. I would betray the emperor for a bowl of rice. I would betray everything I was taught to believe for one meal. This is what hunger does. It strips away everything that makes you human and leaves only an animal that wants to eat. If anyone finds this diary, please send it to my family in Hokkaido. Tell them I died well. Tell them I died for the emperor. Don't tell them the truth. Don't tell them I died like this. Kiyoshi Kamiko's body was found by Australian troops in July 1944, approximately 3 months after his final diary entry. He was lying in his foxhole, still holding the pencil. He weighed an estimated 72 pounds. His diary was sent to Allied intelligence for translation and analysis. A copy was eventually forwarded to his family in Hokkaido in 1948, 3 years after the war ended. His mother died 6 months after receiving it. His father never spoke of the diary to anyone. The family kept it hidden for decades, ashamed of how their son had died. Not in glorious combat, but slowly, miserably, abandoned by the empire he had served. Kiyoshi Kamiko's story was not unique. It was typical. Thousands of Japanese soldiers kept similar diaries. Most were lost or destroyed. Those that survived tell variations of the same story: hunger, degradation, abandonment, death. And always there is the awareness that the enemy is not suffering like this, that American soldiers are eating, that supply ships arrive regularly at American positions, that the war being fought is fundamentally unequal in ways that have nothing to do with courage or strategy. There is a particular entry in the diary of another Japanese soldier, name unknown, stationed on Bougainville in 1944. We can hear music coming from the American camp at night. They have a radio. They have electricity. They have everything. We have nothing. Tomorrow, we are supposed to attack their position. Lieutenant says we will overwhelm them with our spirit, but I cannot even walk to the latrine without resting twice. How am I supposed to attack? With what strength? Using what bullets? We have 8 rounds of ammunition left in the entire platoon. The Americans fire 8 rounds every time they see movement in the jungle. They waste ammunition like we waste breath, because they have so much they can afford to waste it. This was the reality of the Pacific War by late 1944. Not a contest between equals, but a mismatch so profound that the outcome was never in doubt. Japan had lost the war the moment it began, but its soldiers were still dying, still suffering, still fighting battles they could not win for an empire that could not supply them. And American sailors were still complaining about ice cream. In December 1944, a minor controversy erupted aboard the USS Missouri, the newest and most powerful battleship in the American fleet. The ship's ice cream machine, a brand new model, installed just before the ship left port, was producing ice cream that, according to multiple crew complaints, had an off taste. The vanilla tasted wrong. The chocolate was grainy. Dozens of sailors filed formal complaints with their department heads. The ship's captain, William Callahan, took the matter seriously enough to mention it in his log. An investigation was launched. Navy technicians flew out to examine the machine. They discovered that the refrigeration unit was operating at slightly too warm a temperature, causing ice crystals to form improperly. The unit was recalibrated. Problem solved. The incident took up approximately 40 man-hours of labor and resulted in 3 pages of official paperwork. Meanwhile, 300 miles away on a bypassed island whose name appears on no maps and in no history books, 70 Japanese soldiers died of starvation in a single week. No investigation was launched. No paperwork was filed. Nobody flew out to solve the problem. The soldiers died. Their bodies were left where they fell, and the war moved on. This is not a morality tale. This is not a story about American callousness or Japanese victimhood. This is a story about industrial capacity and what it means in modern warfare. The Americans were not cruel to care about ice cream while enemy soldiers starved. They were simply operating within a system that had so much surplus capacity that ice cream was a solvable problem. When a machine broke, you fixed it. When supplies ran low, you requisitioned more. When soldiers complained, you listened, because maintaining morale was cheaper than replacing soldiers broken by poor morale. The Japanese, by contrast, were operating within a system that had no surplus capacity. When a supply ship was sunk, there was no replacement. When food ran out, soldiers starved. When soldiers complained, they were beaten for showing weakness, because the system had no solution to offer except demands for greater sacrifice. One system treated soldiers as valuable assets worth maintaining. The other system treated soldiers as expendable resources to be used until exhausted. And the outcome of the war was determined by which philosophy proved correct. America's industrial base in World War II was not just about making things. It was about making things so efficiently, so abundantly, that waste became acceptable. That surplus became normal. That the question was never, do we have enough? But rather, what flavor should we make today? Consider the Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that formed the backbone of American logistics. Before the war, building a cargo ship took approximately 12 months. American shipyards, using mass production techniques pioneered by industrialist Henry Kaiser, reduced that time to an average of 42 days. Some Liberty ships were built in less than 5 days from keel laying to launch. The fastest, the SS Robert E. Peary, was built in 4 days and 15 hours. These were not small boats. Liberty ships displaced 14,000 tons, fully loaded and measured over 400 feet long. They were ocean-going vessels capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. And America built 2,700 of them during the war. That's more tonnage than the entire Japanese merchant fleet at the start of the war. And Liberty ships were just one category. America also built escort carriers, tankers, troop transports, hospital ships, repair ships, ammunition ships, refrigerated cargo ships, and dozens of other specialized vessels. By 1945, at the peak of production, American shipyards were launching a major warship every day and multiple cargo vessels every single day. The total tonnage launched exceeded Japan's total wartime production by a factor of 10. The same story played out. In every category: aircraft production, tank production, truck production, ammunition production, food production, medicine production. Everything America touched, it produced in quantities that defied comprehension. By contrast, Japan's industrial capacity was always limited and declined steadily throughout the war. American submarines, operating with devastating effectiveness, sank Japanese merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced. The mining campaign Operation Starvation, launched in 1945, closed most major Japanese ports and strangled what remained of the merchant fleet. By June 1945, shipping through Kobe had declined by 85%, from 320,000 tons in March to just 44,000 tons. Without merchant shipping, Japan's war economy collapsed. Raw materials from conquered territories in Southeast Asia could not reach factories in Japan. Finished weapons could not reach frontline units. Food could not reach cities. The entire system ground to a halt. And on bypassed islands throughout the Pacific, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers sat and waited and starved, while American supply convoys sailed past them carrying ice cream. There is one final story worth telling. It comes from the post-war interrogation of a Japanese lieutenant colonel named Tadashi Nakano, who survived the war after being captured on Okinawa in June 1945. The interrogating officer, an American Army intelligence captain, asked Nakano when he first believed Japan would lose the war. Nakano thought for a moment and replied, "At Guadalcanal, but not for the reason you think." "What do you mean?" the captain asked. "I was not at Guadalcanal," Nakano explained. "But I knew many officers who were evacuated from there. They told me about the conditions, about the starvation, about watching supply ships being sunk, about eating grass and insects, and they told me about seeing American positions across the island." "What about them?" "They said the Americans had lights at night, electric lights, generators running constantly. They could hear music. They could smell food cooking. One officer told me he watched through binoculars as American soldiers threw away half-eaten meals because they didn't want them." "Throw them away. Food we would have killed for, and they threw it in garbage bins as casually as you would discard a cigarette." "And this made you think Japan would lose?" "Yes, because I understood then that we were not fighting soldiers. We were fighting an economic system. We were fighting factories and supply chains, and a nation so wealthy that its soldiers could afford to waste food. How do you defeat that? How do you defeat an enemy that has so much that waste is acceptable?" The captain wrote down Nakano's response verbatim. It appears in the interrogation transcript filed at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Nakano's observation cuts to the heart of why Japan lost the Pacific War. Japan did not lose because its soldiers lacked courage. Japanese soldiers displayed courage, determination, and willingness to sacrifice that matched or exceeded any fighting force in history. Japan did not lose because of poor strategy, though strategic errors certainly occurred. Japan lost because it entered a war of industrial attrition against an opponent with 10 times its industrial capacity and 100 times its ability to project logistics across oceanic distances. In 1944, the United States had a gross domestic product of approximately $1.5 trillion in today's currency. Japan's GDP was approximately $200 billion. The United States was 7 times wealthier. It had more steel, more oil, more electricity, more machine tools, more engineers, more scientists, more of everything that mattered in industrial warfare. But wealth alone does not win wars. The Soviet Union, by GDP, was poorer than Germany, yet defeated Germany on the Eastern Front. What matters is how wealth is mobilized, organized, and deployed. And here, America's advantage became insurmountable. The American system treated logistics as a science. Military planners calculated precisely how many tons of supplies were needed per soldier per day. They calculated shipping requirements, port capacity, storage needs, distribution networks. They built redundancy into every system. They anticipated problems and pre-positioned solutions. They approached war the way a corporation approaches manufacturing, as a problem of inputs, processes, and outputs that could be optimized through rational analysis. The Japanese system, by contrast, treated logistics as somehow beneath the dignity of warriors. Real soldiers, the thinking went, did not worry about food and ammunition. Real soldiers made do with what they had. Real soldiers overcame material disadvantage through superior spirit. This philosophy pervaded Japanese military culture from top to bottom. It was not a bug in the system. It was a feature, a deliberate choice, based on centuries of samurai tradition that valued spiritual purity over material concerns. And this philosophy killed more Japanese soldiers than all American weapons combined. The final accounting of Japanese military deaths in World War II shows approximately 2.3 million killed. Of these, about 1.4 million, roughly 60%, died away from the battlefield, succumbing to disease and starvation. They died not because Americans shot them, but because their own supply system failed them, because their own nation could not or would not feed them, because logistics was neglected in favor of spirit. American military deaths in the Pacific Theater totaled approximately 100,000. Tragic, yes, but 1/14 the Japanese total. And American deaths from starvation and disease were negligible. American soldiers died in combat. Japanese soldiers died in foxholes, waiting for rice that never came. This disparity, this overwhelming, brutal disparity, was not accidental. It was the inevitable result of two completely different approaches to warfare. One side valued its soldiers enough to keep them fed, healthy, and equipped. The other side valued its soldiers' willingness to die, but not their ability to live. And in the end, the side that valued life defeated the side that romanticized death. Not because life is inherently more valuable than death in some abstract moral sense, but because living soldiers can fight and dead soldiers cannot. Because fed soldiers are stronger than starving soldiers. Because a military that treats logistics as warfare will always defeat a military that treats logistics as an afterthought. The ice cream barge was not a frivolous indulgence. It was a weapon, not a weapon that killed directly, but a weapon that kept American sailors happy, healthy, and effective. A weapon that said, "We have so much industrial capacity that we can afford this." A weapon that demoralized the enemy not through violence, but through demonstration of overwhelming material superiority, and it worked. By late 1944, Japanese morale was shattered not by bombing, but by the simple, undeniable reality that they were starving while their enemies feasted. This knowledge, this visceral, daily, inescapable knowledge, broke the spirit of soldiers who had been trained from childhood to believe that spirit was all that mattered. The ice cream barge operated in the Western Pacific from 1945 until the end of the war. It survived without incident, never attacked, never threatened, producing thousands of gallons of ice cream that made American sailors happy, while Japanese soldiers 3 miles away died of hunger. After the war, The barge was decommissioned and eventually scrapped. No memorial marks its location. No museum displays its artifacts. It appears in history books, when it appears at all, as a curious footnote, an amusing anecdote about American excess during wartime. But the ice cream barge was not excess. It was the logical expression of an industrial system that had solved the problem of scarcity so completely that even frozen desserts became abundant in the middle of the Pacific Ocean during the largest war in human history. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.